Welcome to High Truths on Drugs and Addiction, where national experts bring you facts and answer your questions. I'm your host, Dr. Ronit Lev, an emergency and addiction doctor who has worked at the White House and still practices on the front lines. Right here on High Truths, you will learn from experts, hear stories from the emergency department, and listen to people who have struggled from addiction. Each episode, we will answer questions from you, our listeners. To learn more about the show, submit a question, access educational material, or even take a quiz, you can visit us on hightruths.com. Today's episode is sponsored by Families Against Fentanyl. FAF is an organization set on breaking the status quo of failed solutions and to get to the core supply chain of deadly fentanyl. Learn more by visiting familiesagainstfentanyl.org and sign their petition to declare illegal fentanyl a weapon of mass destruction. Hi, everyone. Let's talk about supply and demand. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? The chicken and egg metaphor are used as a causality dilemma. In drugs, what is more critical, the supply of drugs coming from across our borders or the demand for drugs from our citizens? Let's look at history to learn. During the Vietnam War, some of our troops were exposed to heroin and became addicted. And yet when they returned home, their heroin addiction ended. Speaking to America's drug czar during the Vietnam War, it is clear that heroin availability was limited in the United States, and therefore heroin did not follow our troops home from Vietnam. There was lack of supply. Fast forward to the prescription opioid epidemic, the driver of overdose deaths was a supply of prescriptions, peaking in 2013. The drugs were infused by the medical community, myself included. Today, prescription pain pills are no longer the leading cause of overdoses. Ending the supply of prescription opioids ended that epidemic. In the beginning of this century, deaths from illicit fentanyl did not exist. Today, fentanyl is the driver of all overdose deaths. Today, methamphetamine use is almost considered normal for people who are homeless. Supply matters. Addressing the causes of addiction in terms of genetics, adverse childhood events, and filling a void is important. Providing treatment with compassion and eliminating stigma for care is crucial. However, supply matters. It matters a lot. And scientifically speaking, the egg came before the chicken. It's not such a big dilemma. And with that mini monologue, let's hear our High Truths questions for the day.
Thank you, Dr. Lev, for your High Truths podcasts and taking my question. This is Jim Crittenden. I'm the coordinator of alcohol, tobacco, and other drug use at the San Diego County Office of Education. And I'm wondering what kind of changes we've seen over the last 6 years or so between the writing of Dreamland and The Least of Us. I know from an education perspective or working with youth, we've certainly seen a shift from, the old adage of kids getting opioids from their parents or grandparents' medicine cabinets to really a shift in counterfeit pills. We know that teens aren't, for the most part, not taking fentanyl intentionally. It's the counterfeit pills. So the shift we've seen is really towards the counterfeit pills, and we're seeing more deaths now among young people that we didn't see 6 years ago. So I'm wondering what other changes Mr. Quinones has seen over the same 6-year period.
Thank you, Jim. It is an excellent question for our special High Truths expert and acclaimed author. Sam Quinones is a Los Angeles-based freelance journalist, former LA Times reporter, and author of 4 books of narrative nonfiction. In 2015, he published the best-selling book Dreamland, The True Tale of the American Opiate Epidemic, which awakened the country to a nationwide scourge of addiction to opioids and heroin. His latest book, The Least of Us, True Tales of America and Hope in the Time of Fentanyl and Meth, which chronicles how the epidemic has evolved from opioids into synthetic drugs. Sam's bio and contact information are posted on the High Truths show notes. Sam Quinones, welcome to High Truths. It's such a delight to have you and an honor to be one of the first to talk with you since the release of The Least of Us. It must be very exciting for you to complete a major project.
Yes, it's a little like running a marathon, frankly. You're just exhausted and your brain's shot. And but it's certainly, I love the life and I love the work. And so it's not like I hated it for certainly. It's just, it is a ton of work. You walk around for 3 years, like with the something big on your back, now it's gone. So that feels good.
That's great. Yeah, like you gave birth to this wonderful new book.
For 3 years, I was pregnant. That's right.
And your book is called The Least of Us. And tell us about the inspiration behind that title.
Sure. It really grew, I think, from what I was doing with Dreamland, the book that I wrote prior to this. And The Least of Us is a kind of it's a follow-up, but it's really its own story. But it does have roots in Dreamland. And that was about the opioid epidemic and pain pill prescribing and heroin traffickers figuring out that was creating a new market for their dope and that kind of stuff. And that's what I thought the story was when I started Dreamland. I was very compartmentalized and compact, and it was going to be, but as time went on, what I came to realize that it was the story was deeper than that, much deeper, and that I would do well to recognize that fact. And so I began to dig into all the different ways that it was, I believe it's, for example, connected very deeply to our really a kind of a nationally kind of a destruction of community, isolation, and that kind of thing. It's also connected, I think, to the idea, the opioid epidemic was that we wanted big, splashy, sexy answers to our problems. And so for the problem of human pain, a very, very complex thing involving the brain, the central nervous system, what do we get? We get one pill for everybody and it's going to solve all our pain. And there was almost this messianic fervor in the 80s by the 1990s that infected a lot of folks saying, we're going to end pain forever. And by just giving this one kind of pill to almost everybody, regardless of their background or their family history or on and on, all that kind of stuff.
Mistake.
And I began to think, part of this is that we wanted big, and really humans change and we achieve positive, productive change by working in very, very small things and very small on things that we can manage locally on our neighborhood level, within our family, this kind of thing. And it made me start thinking I read the Bible during this time. I'm not a Christian, but I read the book of particularly the book of Matthew, in which Jesus says, that which you do for the least of my brethren, you do for me. And I began to think of how powerful that idea was and that how we had gotten away from it in many, many ways. Just in a way of who we admired, wealthy athletes, wealthy executives, everybody has got to be big and splashy and sexy, when the real people doing the work are really in the unnoticed, unheralded parts of this country. And so I kind of set out to write a book, obviously, about the major trends in drug trafficking now, which are extraordinarily important to every American, coast to coast, to every city, every town, every street, I believe. But along the way, I didn't want it just to be about that. I wanted it to be about the smallest, the least stories, the people doing community repair on the smallest, most unheralded, non-sexy way, because I believe that is how we make productive change and move forward. And that is how we best confront and approach these extraordinarily powerful and deadly drugs that are on our street. And so that is kind of a little bit how The Least of Us came to be the title, because it seems to me that we do well to focus on the least of us within us. What is the smallest parts of us, the least of us within a neighborhood, the least of us within a town, seemed to me to encapsulate a lot of what I was trying to say.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So Sam, you wrote another masterpiece work that really touches America. I encourage everyone to read it, The Least of Us. And if you like Dreamland, you will not want to miss on the continued saga. This High Truths episode, the question comes from Jim Creedon, who works in education. And he asks, how has the issue of drugs changed in 6 years between writing Dreamland in 2015 and The Least of Us in 2021? Some things are much worse, like the death toll, but some things have improved.
Yes, and I would say that that's kind of the two parts to this the next book, The Least of Us. On the one hand, you find that the drug trafficking world has taken over as the almost entirely, to a great degree, the source of drug supply. Used to be, on the opioid epidemic, the source of supply was really doctors' prescription pads. That has changed. Now, the opioid painkillers may still be prescribed a little too much, I think, perhaps, but certainly they've come down significantly since the days when I was writing Dreamland. However, the underworld has taken up the slack, and now most of the drugs that are, and particularly the drugs that are doing the gravest damage to us as a country, fentanyl and methamphetamine, of course, they're all provided by the underworld. So you have seen, and those two drugs are symbolic of where we're headed in terms of drug consumption and drug dealing and so on. And that is, we are now in the era of synthetic drugs, and we can talk about more about why that is. But at the same time, I have to say, something that was very striking, very unexpected to me after Dreamland came out, was the amount of awareness it began to create, and the kind of the grassroots movements, you might say, although not terribly organized, but nevertheless movements of people saying, let's deal with this. We have to deal with this. And that was a stunning thing to watch, because when I was writing Dreamland, I was overwhelmed by the fact that nobody wanted to talk about it. It was very quiet. If it wasn't a cop or a public health administrator or nurse, you couldn't really find people to talk. The media, except for in a few areas, really didn't talk much about it. Politicians almost didn't understand it sometimes. And whatever the case, you would find families, especially, and this was the crux of it, families especially of addicts, mothers, daughters, sons, uncles, whatever, were so mortified, so unwilling to talk about it. Very much like the early days of the AIDS epidemic. I always liken it to that. You remember when the first AIDS obituary started coming out, it was leukemia. He died of leukemia. No HIV, no AIDS, none of that, Yeah. And so now what you're finding, what I've found, is that there's an enormous knowledge and awareness of this issue. And when I put on my subtitle to Dreamland was The True Tale of America's Opiate Epidemic, because the awareness of this problem was so deep that and so coast to coast, really, that if I used the word opioid, nobody would have known what that is. Now everybody uses that word. It's a very common word. You see it in headlines, you see it in news stories, you see people using it all the time. But at the time, I realized that if I use that word, no one would know. Everybody knows what an opiate is. Nobody had a clue what an opioid was. That just didn't ring a bell with anybody. But of course, now that's kind of one tiny barometer of how awareness of this problem has changed, and therefore how priorities, I think, have changed as well.
Yeah, I think we made a lot of progress. I would actually say that our prescription opioid epidemic has ended. I mean, the driver of drugs, physicians are just not prescribing as much as some people saying not even enough, but there's I call it the Goldilocks.
Well, there's that argument too. Sometimes that's right. Yeah.
Goldilocks method of prescribing, not too much, not too little. It has to be just right. True. And we've increased treatment. Stigma is moving in the right direction. Medical schools are teaching residents about the issue of addiction. And so I think we've made a lot of progress. And despite all that, it's so defeating, because with that progress, we still have more deaths, and we just can't catch up with all that treatment that is required. We're not plugging the hole or the faucet of initiating use, and we still have such a problem.
Right. And I think that a lot of that has to do with the vast supplies of drugs that are coming in from Mexico. It's just, and it's not just the vast supplies that are coming in. These are the most deadly in the case of fentanyl, the most mind-mangling in the case of meth, drugs that we have ever seen, and they are cheap beyond belief, and they are relentless, and they are coast to coast, right? It's not like the days of, again, this is the days of synthetic drugs. You can make synthetic drugs all year round if two things are true. If you control law enforcement, which the trafficking world does to the degree it needs to, which is pretty effectively, and if you have access to enough chemicals to make these drugs in a lab, because this is the great realization that they've been coming to gradually over the culture of drug trafficking in Mexico. If you produce drugs in a lab, you don't need land. You don't care if it's raining or sunny outside. You don't need farmers. You don't need pesticides. You're not exposed to helicopters and whatever coming over you put it in a lab, and all you really care about, you don't care about land, you care about shipping ports. Because the shipping ports are where you are going to get access to the world's chemical market. And if you can get access to that, and you have control of the ports, and then you have control of law enforcement, you can get as much of those chemicals as you need to produce what we are seeing today in America, which is ungodly quantities, just staggering, boggles the mind sometimes to think of how they're able to supply so much dope coast to coast. So the price drops and keeps dropping and dropping. You can do that. You can make those drugs year round. And that is the issue we are facing as a country right now, that the supply is relentless. It's deadlier and more damaging to a human brain than ever before. And it's coming in quantities that we have never, ever seen. That is the nutshell.
And really, that's another thing that really changed, you said, from Dreamland to The Least of Us, is the distribution. And in Dreamland, you made the analogy of pizza delivery. But now, like you said, why spend 2 years growing a coca plant when you could just make it a lot cheaper and easier in a warehouse?
Right. And that is what's going on now. The guys that I wrote about in Dreamland are probably still in business. The truth is they don't matter anymore, though. That's the thing. That they mattered to me because they were the pioneers. They weren't the only traffickers of heroin from Mexico, but they were, because of their system and because they were all from the same town. And when they competed, they couldn't kill each other. So they had to find new markets. They were all constantly very expansionary. And they just happened to land in Columbus, Ohio in 1998, 2 years after OxyContin comes on the market. And a few of them recognize the market for what it really is, an enormous gold mine forming in the distance. And they exploited it because they had the system, and they have endless amounts of labor coming up from Mexico, from towns nearby, and so on. And that's why I focused on them, because they were the pioneers. They were the first ones to recognize, and then systematically exploit the coming market for heroin that all those pain pills represented. But since then, many things have changed, but one of them is that they were major players in their day. In every market they were in, they were significant contributors to the drug supply in those areas. And now they simply aren't anymore. There's just, they're continuing to work, but they don't matter as much because everybody's involved in it. So many people are involved in the United States, so many more involved in Mexico. And it's just like their day they're still making money, some of them, I'm sure, but they don't matter because the market now is exploded. It's thousands and thousands of people on both sides of the border. And it's just much larger than anything they were involved in back in the late 90s into the 2000s.
You know what, when you say that, it makes me think of social media, how we used to have, only a few TV stations and a few markets for news. And now everybody's got their own podcast.
The drug world is very much like a little bit like social media. It's also a little bit like, a gold rush. Once one person starts making money, There's no licensing, there's no trademarks or copyright. You can get into the business as easily as you get into anything, if you don't mind the threat of going to jail. And so that's what has happened. It's just such a very large market now, and we created it honestly with this brand new market of people, a lot of younger people, a lot of people with money, through the opioid epidemic, and then the underworld stepped in and said, "Yeah, we'll take it from here," kind of, you know what I mean? So, and that's what they have done out of Mexico, obviously relying on supply routes, on immigrant populations, just like any mafia. The Italian mob did the same. Wherever there were Italians, there was an Italian mafia. Well, the same thing is true of Mexican drug trafficking. And they've just taken advantage of all that infrastructure, if you like to call it that, our highways, our money wiring systems, and all that stuff. And they've kind of and now they have brought these drugs like nationwide, really.
You focus on Mexico because you've spent a lot of time there, but it also is coming from Canada, right?
I would say not very much. Yes, I'm sure some is coming from Canada. No, I think that's not the story, though. The big story really is Mexico. I'd be surprised if 10% of our illegal drugs, I mean, it depends which drug you're talking about, I suppose, but I think I'd be surprised if 10% of our drugs, the fentanyl and methamphetamine, I'm pretty sure no methamphetamine is made in Canada anymore. Right. It may come from Mexico up to Canada and come south, I guess, maybe. But truthfully, I don't see Canada. Canada has the same issues we have, just in much, much smaller scale. And so, no, I would say that yes, Canada is to some degree this issue, but I would say that the real game is Mexico. The real story is Mexico.
Now, both Dreamland and The Least of Us, you featured Walmart and shoplifting as a way of paying for addiction. I happen to love shopping at Walmart. Is there a specific issue with Walmart?
Well, what I was trying to do with some of that was to say, first of all, it's important, I think, when you analyze a drug market in a certain area, it's made up of people, okay? And so I spend a lot of time trying to understand who started this, who did this, who did that, you know? I happen to be, the way I got onto this story, I happened to be in the town of Portsmouth, Ohio, which is where the Dreamland pool, which I named the earlier book after, once existed. Mm-hmm. And in Portsmouth, there's not now a lot of things going on there. A lot of people have left. The businesses have dried up. Main Street is a shell. For a long time, the steel factory left. All these different things left. And so what they really have in town is a Walmart. So my question is, well, how do people who get addicted fund their drug addiction? And I found over and over, and I'm telling you, there's a significant body of people who can tell you all about this connection, that the way you fund your drug addiction is through Walmart. Walmart, for a few reasons. One is that Walmart has replaced Main Street. So you can get everything you needed on Main Street in a Walmart. Frequently, you are dealing with small-time dealers who have families, who have needs, and they will tell you what to steal in order for you to get the drugs from them. So TVs, children's shoes, T-bone steaks, electronics of a wide variety, hardware, tools, and whatnot. The only place you can really go is Walmart, even in areas, though, where there are other places you can steal from. So many people told me how easy it was to rip. So what you have is, over a period, my intention was also to understand how we have destroyed community. Well, in a town where there's a vibrant Main Street, where everybody's store is locally owned, all the owners and the managers, they know who to look out for. They know who not to let in their store, somebody who's known, and they all are there actively protecting their store. So at the same time as a town like Portsmouth and many, many, many other towns, has lost its Main Street, folks who would support the local junior high theater group whereas Walmart would not. So the local Little League, all these like butcher shops and clothing shops and shoe stores and on and on and on, the same thing that kind of populated the typical Main Street, they're all gone. You have a big gaping hole where that they leave in your community's ability to fend for itself and fend off some of these things. And at the same time, you have Walmart taking their place. Walmart, which doesn't necessarily allow people to shoplift, but my goodness, it's so easy to do. I've been in Walmart several times when I could have just walked out with whatever I had without anybody saying anything to me. And that's when you have a drug problem, that is a major source of the drug revenue. I really believe this problem would not have.
Do you know who I think is funding the drugs of America?
What's that?
I think government is. I think our government is paying for addiction in the back end, clearly, and with the health costs and societal costs and crime costs, but also in the front end with we're actually paying for those drugs with the disability checks and COVID checks. That's what I've seen.
That is also, sure. And so all of this to me makes me feel that one area we need to focus on, prevention is first. I don't think we move anywhere without a very serious thought given to how we prevent this stuff in the first place. And that's where community repair, in my opinion, is so important. But also we need to understand that a big part of this is nobody gets treated with success and gets it, not nobody, but very few people get treated with success if every time they come out, they're being inundated with the most dangerous, deadly, mind-mangling drugs we've ever seen on our street. And so that has to be a fundamental part of what we do, and people have to understand the supply is huge, and and have to understand also if we live next to two Canadas, we wouldn't be having, I don't believe, the problem that we have with the supply. We don't. So
I agree with you. I think that's very important. You can't just, collect buckets of water without closing the faucet.
And we're repairing the holes in the boat. That's kind of what we're doing and we're trying to do. And at the same time, I would say this, and I put this is also talk about this in the book, the least of us. We have an extraordinary role in creating what's going on down in Mexico. And people like to point to our drug demand. I think far more important is the quantities of guns that go south from the United States to Mexico. It's quite an amazing thing that's gone on for years. Those guys have armed themselves with our guns. Guns that have been bought very easily, far too easily, if you ask me, from stores and gun shows and whatnot. And all of that is going south and is arming. Now, those folks now, of course, can get their weapons elsewhere in international markets, but I think the most easily obtained guns are continue to be from the United States. And that's what arms them to allow them to make drugs with such impunity down in Mexico.
That discussion hurts my stomach because it also makes me think of Afghanistan, how our weapons are going to be ending up in the wrong hand. But let's go back to drugs. I actually think fentanyl, if you think about it, is being used today, right now, as a weapon of mass destruction. If you make the analogy to COVID, an infectious disease, and however it came, but that's like destroying our country, making us divided, and it's hurting everyone, health-wise, economics, and fentanyl is doing the same kind of thing in a very insidious kind of way. So, and
it's devastating to the human brain. It's devastating to humans, and it's actually a magnificent drug when it's used medically. I've had fentanyl when I had my heart attack, and I think it's a great drug if you use it the proper way. Of course, that's right. It's not in the proper hands. It can be just a tornado of destruction.
Right. Most people have had a colonoscopy too, have had some fentanyl. Let's switch to methamphetamines. You talk about P2p methamphetamine and how it's causing terrible psychosis, and how the method of P2p is different from previous types of methamphetamine.
Well, there was a previous type. There's only two types that I know of. I'm sure there's others, perhaps, but when this story, there's really only been two. For many years, the Mexican trafficking world kind of industrialized, dominated the meth market, certainly in the United States, with the use of a chemical known as ephedrine, which is very easily transformed chemically into meth. They could get it. It was legal. It's used in antihistamines. It's used in Sudafed pills, all that, and it's very easy to get. They were able to get that locally, but then import a lot of it on world markets. In fact, this dates back to really like the late 80s, early 90s. They figured out if we go to India and China and Hong Kong, places like that, we can get all this stuff just shipped in them, and they did. That allowed them to really industrialize the amounts of meth that they were making in factories, and the weapons that they used and the control of law enforcement that they had allowed them to put in laboratories that really didn't move. They have to move. And then in 2008, the Mexican government made ephedrine illegal, and except for a few chemical companies to use. And so what happened was they had to change. Now, there is another method of making methamphetamine that just does not involve ephedrine. It involves a lot of different chemicals. It involves a precursor known as phenyl 2-propanone, P2p, as you say. They figured out that P2p had many drawbacks, but it had one very, very important benefit, and that was that it could be made from a variety of chemicals. There was no way you could really regulate and control the bottleneck production the way the government did with ephedrine, because if you didn't make P2P one way, you could make it another way, and not that way a third. There's many, many ways of making P2P, this essential component in this one way. And so they began to do that. What that allowed them to do was create supply, which is what we are now seeing in the last, I would say, 7 years across the United States, from Maine now, where New Hampshire and Vermont never had any meth, to LA, which has always had it since the Mexican trafficking world got involved in it. You were seeing unbelievable, just staggering supply, so much that the price has dropped by like 80%, 90% in almost everywhere in the country.
Yeah.
And that has been possible because of P2P meth, because they have access to ports, they have access to world chemical markets, and they can make as much of that stuff all year round. No seasons, no weather is important anymore. It's just how much chemical you can get. The problem is, as they did this, and they figure out how to divide the meth. So the worthless meth they take and they throw away. They dump it in the countryside of Mexico and rivers and wherever else. It's horrible.
You're talking about the isomers, the L isomer and the D isomer?
Yes, right. Exactly. The D-meth, and so they're sending that stuff, and they have figured out how to do that. No other trafficker, according to DA chemists I've talked to, has ever figured out en masse industrial ways of separating those two meths. So you actually are only exporting the stuff that causes the psychoactive reaction, and you're not, and the other stuff you dump. The problem is that the chemicals in which they are making P2P meth, with which they're making P2P meth, are all industrial toxic chemicals. They're lye, cyanide, benzene. I mean, all these, hydrochloric acid. I'm sorry?
Acetone.
All of that stuff.
Yes,
all of that stuff. It is. And so what has happened is, as this meth has marched across the country, really they got this first supplies became bigger than anything we'd ever seen, beginning in about 2013-14 on the West Coast. And then it kind of marches its way across, and you see supplies of this stuff reaching Midwest in about 2016-17, by the spring of 17 for sure. And then another couple of years, and you see it up in Vermont and New Hampshire and places that never had meth before. The problem is that this stuff is not just made with toxic chemicals. It is also creates in the human brain symptoms of schizophrenia, it renders people mentally ill very, very quickly. Yes. And this is generally, again, symptoms of schizophrenia, paranoia, very scary paranoia, hallucinations, things coming out of the walls. And it happens very quickly. You remember the meth posters that used to show those folks with the mug shots.
This is
And it
your
would be
face on meth.
5, 6 years of mug shots, and you'd see the gradual decay of the person, maybe 8 years, whatever it was. It was a fairly long time. That's not what's happening now. It's happening very quickly. People go very quickly insane on this methamphetamine. It's creating a whole swath of mentally ill Americans all across the country. San Diego, I guarantee it's going on down there. But
No, we're ground zero. We are ground zero. We're pretty much the meth capital of the world, I think.
Exactly. And that is, and so what this has done also is it has created horrible, horrible problems with homelessness. A lot of homelessness. Now, homelessness is, we speak about it as one thing. It's not one thing. There's a lot of different kinds of homelessness. There's families that, lost a job and therefore have to live with other families on a garage sofa, say, something like that. That's very different. That's a different kind of homelessness than the kind I'm talking about. But the kind I'm talking about is the very public homelessness that you see now in those tent encampments in Skid Row or by the set of freeways or wherever. In LA, it's quite notable. Everywhere. It looks almost third worldy. And at Venice Beach, they have these big encampments.
I feel like I live in a third world now.
Yeah,
I live in San Diego, but I have to go literally walk over bodies to get to work.
Yes, exactly. And in Venice Beach, they call that whole area Methlehem instead of Bethlehem, And so what's happened is this meth that's coming out of Mexico now is not only addicting people and doing bad things to their teeth, and it is turning people insane, absolutely insane. And which lasts, I've been told by a lot of folks, I've talked to a lot of folks about this now, even sometimes after people stop using, it takes a while, it takes months for a brain to recover from the damage, this deep, profound, scary, almost existential damage.
They've done PET scans and you could actually see holes in the brain. The good thing is if you stop, you can recover, but you're right. It does take some time. Again, working in the emergency department, this is my bread and butter. Unfortunately, it's very hard to find someone who's homeless who's not on methamphetamine, and the exacerbation of psychosis and agitation. I see, law enforcement and paramedics coming in, and somebody who's having a terrible, violent, agitated delirium. They have no idea, and then I come in as this 5-foot doctor and administer more drugs.
And the big question then is, how do you treat for drug addiction somebody who you cannot really communicate with? That is a big, big question facing treatment folks now. The other question, of course, is
you have to get control of the situation first.
Right.
You have to deal with the emergency first.
And so that's what I think what's happening is very often ERs are kind of becoming a little bit to resemble jails, because you have to control people. You can't just say, whatever, just go where, that you can't just sit in the waiting room for a while. No, the people won't sit quietly and peacefully.
Well, I wouldn't want to call us jails because we're providing medical care. And
no, I didn't say you were becoming jails. You come to resemble it. Certain things that you're doing now have to control people. Whereas I've seen this in other places. I'm not sure your place, but in other places.
We have patients who come in with what's called agitated delirium or excited delirium, and it's a violent reaction. And you're right, we have to physically control them when we control them chemically to sedate them and allow them to detoxify, and then hopefully have a conversation. And the problem with methamphetamine, somebody could come in drunk, and they don't know what's going on. They sober up in a few hours, and then you can have a conversation. Marijuana, cocaine, methamphetamine, it could take 3 days to detoxify and be able to have a conversation. And that's what's impacting our emergency departments. And I wouldn't say our emergency departments are like a jail. I'd say that they're like a psych ward.
Yes, right. Yeah, I've in the book, one of the places I talk about is an ER in Columbus, Ohio, where they've had to put metal over the TVs, metal casings, all this kind of stuff to prevent. And they don't do certain things anymore. They used to put the TV on Sundays, and people some people would come in off the street to watch a football game, right? And now, because of the meth users, it's just not possible to do that. They're out of their minds, and they cannot, and this is but the problem is really, how do you treat someone who is insane? Now, I've heard people now, about your experience, of course, on that, but I've heard people say, for a lot of the people we're dealing with, it's weeks, if not months, before we can actually get to a place where their personality once again emerges.
Right.
So
drugs hijack your brain, but meth is much
meth.
worse. So I just want to clarify one thing for our audience. Methamphetamine is methamphetamine. It's not that the P2p method or the ephedrine method is different. It's the same drug. What you're saying that's different is in Mexico, they figured out a way to separate. Methamphetamine has both like the right hand and the left hand parts of the chemical to it. That's what the isomers are called. And they're able to separate the stuff that doesn't get you high, leave you just with the good stuff, the right hand of the drug, which is why it's so much more potent. Is that what you're?
But I think the truth is nobody quite knows. No one studied this. No one has really even written about this, as far as I know. I've been surprised at how little there is on. There's almost nothing on this, as a matter of fact. Even though I think it's once you dig down into it, you could see the connection very easily. I think what's happening is what one guy told me. Now, again, I don't have a study to back this up. I'm just saying this sounds reasonable, plausible. And that is that the traffickers down there are not washing. He said he was a former meth cook. So he knows a lot about how to make meth, and he was doing it for a long time before he got clean, and now he runs a rehab clinic. But he said to me, I think what's happening is that those guys are not washing their dope. And that doesn't mean washing it with rags and stuff. It means putting it through chemical washes that get rid of all the chemical residue that is built up in these processes that they use. And that those, why should they? He said, why would they? Because if you wash it, you lose weight, and weight is profit. So why would you want to send up less? You've got this product, send it. Who cares, right? You're not really concerned about the mental stability of your customers because your customers are 3 or 4 levels removed.
That's very interesting. I'm going to have to research that to find out if it's because we're getting more of the less, the stronger isomer, or is it the contaminants that's in the method that's making
it's a great question. And the truth is, all I can tell you is what I've reported. And that is that the folks that I've talked to all across the country report a major shift, a major change, a switch. They're very dramatic. You can talk to people who have been meth users during this change, and they will talk to you about it. And I have. And people who treatment counselors who were working before and after, and they are very eloquent on this topic, that there was a shift when they changed to P2p meth. What is it about P2p meth that is creating this? I don't know, nor do I think anybody truly has ever studied it. However, I would say that when you dig down into ERs, meth encampment, tent encampments, a lot of the homelessness, you will find that meth is there, and it very quickly renders people just incapable of living in a world where they have to follow rules, where they have to actually communicate with people, where they can't wander around at 3 a.m. with a knife stabbing the wall and that kind of thing. So whatever the reason is, I mean, to my way of thinking, the ephedrine meth was pretty pure meth. They could make that very easily. They were very good at it. They could do all of that. That's not so what's different, I don't believe. I believe what's different is that they now have to use all these very toxic chemicals, and some of that is remaining in the stuff. However, I'm willing to bow to whoever wants to deeply, deeply study it. All I know is that there's clearly a connection between it and mental illness, it and homelessness, it perhaps also and officer-involved shootings, because these people are on the street thinking they're going up against Martians or whatever they think. Yeah, it's extraordinarily debilitating, sad, frightening sometimes. And those of you in the ER world are seeing it like every night. Yeah, it's a problem. We actually call 911 for ourselves, for our own safety, a few times a month because it's a tough place to work, a violent place to work. You make some profound comments on the marijuana industry as well. You stated marijuana legalization opened up the methamphetamine trade in Mexico. And you also say that we, and I agree with you, have not learned our lessons from the opioid epidemic with big pot. And you rewrite very succinctly, pot may have medical benefits. Opiates have medical benefits, but supplies matter. There's a theme here. Supply matters. And so does potency and marketing and distribution. And then thank you very much for being brave and stating that. Oh, sure. I mean, that's what my research and reporting has shown. I didn't get into this to write that. I didn't start my book saying I'm going to write something that criticizes the pot world or legalized pot. I'm just noting that this is what I've found as I've done this. So when we began to legalize marijuana, that meant a lot of marijuana producers down in Mexico really couldn't make a living, but not the living they were used to. I think that's really kind of where they were going with that. A lot of them, this happened about the time that meth was, first of all, a major industry, had become a major industry, and then number two, as the P2p meth made it easier for just almost anybody to produce the stuff because there was so many prevalent chemicals. It was just so much more easy for just anybody. And so a lot of people got out of marijuana. Now, you might think the idea is, well, they're going to get out of marijuana and they're going to go into wine making or watermelons or cucumbers or something like that. But the problem is, nobody who's risen in Mexico, I could tell you this, I lived in Mexico for 10 years, wrote 2 books about the country. Nobody who starts out as a ranchero, poor guy, campesino farmer, rises to the middle class or above through drug trafficking is going to go back to ranchero farming. It doesn't make any money. It's hard work. They don't want to do it. I frankly don't blame them sometimes, honestly. Well, what they do get into then, what was available was then methamphetamine. And so people found that they could get even wealthier because the chemicals, again, were so prevalent in that part of Mexico, that western coast of Mexico, where they have these 2 ports that are essential to the story. You've got so many people saying, I'll do that, sure. Or I've got my brother-in-law worked in a lab. Let's get together and we'll put her in our own lab, that kind of thing. And they're very rudimentary, but they have enormous production capacity. They've learned. And so what you're finding is a lot of people are moving into methamphetamine production because also there's almost an economic justice component to it. You can get big quicker. With marijuana, you had to sell to a middleman. Frequently, you just didn't have the infrastructure to get your pot north across the border. Now it's much easier with meth. It's not quite as bulky and it's just easier to make. It's easier to make it year round. You don't have to wait 4 months and all that stuff. And then, so that is how meth has really grown from the remnants of what was the very, very vast and very widespread Mexican pot industry, which still exists, but not to the degree that it once did, for sure. My feelings about legalized pot are that I do believe there's it ought to be considered, but we are missing all the lessons from the opioid epidemic.
Aren't we? It's crazy.
So what are some of the lessons of the what are some of the lessons of the opioid epidemic? Beware of a drug that is legal, that is very potent, and that is marketed with wide and almost unprovable claims or broad claims about its almost virtually risk-free nature. That was the story of the opioid epidemic. That's what opioids were legal, very potent, widely available after a while, certainly, and easily available from many, many doctors in whatever region you want to talk about in the country, and marketed with the idea that there's no risk, virtually no risk, no addictive risk, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that is what we have done with the pot industry or with marijuana. We have legalized it with this idea that it's just pot, dude. You know, it's legal. The problem is it's extraordinarily potent. Now, it wasn't.
And they're using this type of marketing claims, right? Even the CEO of Purdue is now a CEO for Big Pot.
No,
right?
these are marketing claims that's beneficial. And this is the same group. I mean, I remember when Camel Cigarettes was marketing Joe Camel. Yeah. People got very upset at cigarettes being marketed to children. Rightfully so. I thought that was correct.
But this is
what are gummies? What are candy, pot candy, and all this kind of stuff? Cheetos. all of that stuff. To me, it feels like we have just run through all the concerns without any, because you know what, it's just pot. From the questions have not changed. The marijuana has. The question is, what should we legalize marijuana? Well, if the answer is yes, 30 years ago, it was fine to just do it. Now the question is, what pot do we legalize? Do we legalize 80% THC, 30% THC? My feeling is that if we were really responsible and adult about this, we would legalize marijuana with THC levels of no more than 10%. And we would spend the next decade using the money from the taxes, which are supposedly going to generate, we'll see, to fund all kinds of infrastructure that we don't have, of inspecting where pot's grown, inspecting the stores where it, they're just like any grocery store, just like any liquor store.
We monitor it like food, like
exactly.
Like a food. If there's a salmonella outbreak, there's a recall.
Yeah, right? Exactly. And we need that same government intrusion, frankly, in the pot market that has been the case in food, wine, beer, cigarettes, et cetera, all the same thing. We also need to use that money to help law enforcement recognize when people are driving stoned. There's a whole bunch of things that we need to use that money for. Meanwhile, we need to do a variety of studies that show what is the effect on the developing prefrontal cortex of every 19-year-old brain.
I think we already know that. The data is out there a lot on that. We know that your brain is growing until the age 25 or longer, and your chance of addiction is 4 to 7 times higher if you use marijuana, alcohol, tobacco, anything that's addicting. And with marijuana, we also know, and we've done this now, studies with thousands of patients and even millions if you go to Europe, that shows with continued use, you can have psychosis, permanent psychosis that results in schizophrenia.
Right. So all of this, it would seem to me, would give us some humility. Yeah. That's what I'm looking for. Societal humility. We don't know what we're doing. We don't do it very well. It's much better to go very slowly.
I say follow the science. We're telling everyone, follow the science with COVID. It's like, okay, let's follow the science with marijuana too, not just with COVID.
And the other thing that strikes me as very odd, I have to say, is that with marijuana grows very well in the sun, and during a time when we are facing the existential threat of climate change, why are we making it legal for people to grow pot indoors with all that carbon footprint that each of those?
Oh yeah, it's huge. That's very interesting.
It makes no sense. It also seems to me that
the environmentalists should be very much opposed to that. Right?
You would think, and that's one of the reasons I didn't vote for the Proposition, whatever it was, 19 back in, or whatever it was, 16 back in 2019. I think what it was. I didn't vote against it because there was no control of potency. There was no control of indoor growing. There was none of that stuff. There was no, it was all very poorly, a lot of it was poorly done, I felt. The other thing is that we are missing the great lesson of prohibition. Prohibition, before prohibition, anything went, it was just, anybody could drink, kids could drink, et cetera. It was a horrible thing. Then nothing was allowed. You could do anything, then nothing was allowed. 13 years of the Volstead Act in the 20s and 30s, and nothing was allowed. During that time, what developed, because it was unregulated, was the underworld. We developed all this bathtub hooch made with all kinds of toxic crap and gives you the jerks, and people walking around and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, poison.
We decided to once again legalize alcohol, but control it very effectively. I think we've done, frankly, and keeping in mind that that it's most of the alcohol is controlled, 3%, 7%. Yes, you can buy more potent stuff, but
in general, you could trust what you're buying.
I'm sorry?
In general, you could trust what you're buying with alcohol.
Exactly. And it's all very well controlled, and the taxation schemes are all very well watched and all that kind of stuff. And I think that's what we need to do with marijuana. The high potency 80%, 90% THC marijuana is just the marijuana equivalent of that bathtub hooch. We don't want to be selling that at 7-Eleven or any other Green Cross store that you might see along. That's crazy. It boggles the mind. It also shows that what our real interest is not science, nor is it the protection of people. It's in
follow the money,
commerce,
yeah,
just commerce. And what we're seeing now, of course, is the growth of yet another major moneyed interest in our economy, which we do not need another one of, and that is big pot. So I generally am in favor of legalizing this kind of thing if we go retrench significantly and we watch what we're doing and we take it very, very, very slowly, and we don't think we have all the answers because we don't. And we pay
unfortunately,
attention.
we're not doing that.
No, we are not. No, of course, because big pot is managing everything, and there's a lot of money and interests behind this. And there's frankly a lot of interest in the population among folks who don't know the truth. Maybe they were smoking pot when they were 17 in 1978, and they just think marijuana is marijuana. I think that the damage can be, and I think is right now being done from this extraordinarily hyper-potent marijuana. And so that is where I used to believe when I lived in Mexico, I was fervently in favor of all marijuana legalization, because I saw that marijuana was the gateway drug for all traffickers. Chapo Guzman was a marijuana grower before he was anything else. And so when I lived down there, I said to myself, if we do this, we would destroy this industry down here, and that would be a good thing. Then, of course, facts changed. I learned more facts and began to see how it had actually worked out in the United States, and I had a very different, perspective after that. And that's where my ideas began to change on what it seemed to me wise to do. But we've done none of those things,
Yeah. There's the other thing you do in The Least of Us is you talk about various illicit drugs of addiction, and you make the analogy, and it's a true analogy, that addiction of sugar or food or video games or anything, any type of addiction affects the same part of the brain. But yes, I'm worried about that kind of argument, because the consequences of addiction to methamphetamine is much different than drinking too much.
Oh, sure. Yes, of course.
And the association of mental illness and homelessness and crime. And then the analogy of drugs and sugar helps a movement in America that wants to normalize drug use and increase drug use, and making sugar.
I'm not sure that's, the truth is, I have to tell you, Doctor, those are not concerns that a reporter ought to be worried about. Mm-hmm. If you worried about how your story was going to be used, you would never write anything. You can't predict it. And I believe in just telling the story that I saw a story that I thought was worth telling, and it involved these enormous concentrations of power in the legal world, providing all kinds of horribly, I would say pretty strongly addictive stuff to Americans. And I think basically in a lot of cases, paving the way for drug addiction. Now, directly, I know it may be difficult to make that case, but my feeling is that we are constantly immersed in a toxic soup of legal stuff that's addictive. Sugar, social media, pornography, gambling, video games, cigarettes and alcohol, on and on and on and on. There's so much stuff that is kind of priming the brain. Not all, of course, most of us never get involved with addictive illegal drugs, but
it does help us relate. The good part of that analogy is it helps us relate to somebody who has a drug addiction. Like I love chocolate. I can't live without it almost. But so you can kind of understand or relate to somebody who has an addiction to something else, because it's the same part of the brain, but it's not the same consequences. And so I think it doesn't require the same
no, and frequently
regulation, and you don't need police officers to monitor your sugar control or your video game control.
No, of course not. Of course not. But it sometimes it doesn't have the another key symptom of drug addiction, which is very, very difficult withdrawals like opioids have. It doesn't always have, or if it does, I mean, I believe I've withdrawn off sugar and I've withdrawn off tobacco. And I know that they're nothing similar to what a person withdraws off of, that goes through when withdrawing off of heroin. But there is a consequence. You're absolutely right, though. Of course, the consequences are not quite the same. I think the idea was to say, connecting all this up to the title of the book, The Least of Us, is to say that we all have the least of us within us. That's kind of like the last word of the book. In fact, the least of us lies within us all. Beautiful. We all are that addict eating from the trash. We all have that propensity. It's no longer somebody, oh, that guy's a disgusting failure. And if we take the Bible seriously, we are that person too, and we ought to think in those terms, and we all are the least of us. It's another way in which that title made sense, frankly. How people use stuff, though, I have to say that's just not the role of a journalist. You just tell the story that's there, and I've done my very best, and you do your very best and put an effort in and try to understand as many different perspectives, and you come to your own conclusions, your own understanding based on your research, and you write it that way. People will use it. If you had to think about all the ways in which people would use your story, you would sit paralyzed in a corner, never doing anything, Mm-hmm. So that I purposefully don't take into consideration. I know that sounds weird, but
that's good.
But that's an independent journalist talking.
Sam, this has been a wonderful project, and you said you are resting from it, but do you have any idea of what you're going to do next? Do you have ideas?
Oh, man.
Just rest and recover.
I am going to, no. I've got a few little ideas, but right now I just want to kind of wait. I'm still almost in shock from having finished the book. I wander around going, what do I have to write today? And nothing really. Just send out emails to people who might be interested in the book. That's all you got to do. So that's what I'm doing now.
Well, congratulations.
Yes, thank you.
And I invite you to San Diego for any future research. I'd love to show you our emergency department and our collaborative community. I chair a task force called CREDO, Community Response to Drug Overdose, where our vision is to do contact tracing, not just for COVID or infectious disease, but for overdoses, and bring I call it the 3 Ps together: public health, public safety, and prevention. So
wonderful stuff. And I think that's
San Diego.
I would love to. I love San Diego. I get down there a fair amount. When I was living out there, now I'm living in Nashville, but I'll be here for a little bit. But next time when I'm back out there, which I hope to be sometime soon, I'd love to get out there with you. It's just, again, you're part of what is going on all across this country. I don't believe there's many areas in this country that don't see some version of what you see down there in San Diego. So, keep it going and you keep up the good work is all I can say. It's tough stuff, but it's the country relies on what y'all are doing.
And I think that's kind of your final advice to Jim Creedon, who had the question for you today, and for your readers. Your great advice is continue what the least of us are doing to help our communities.
Right, and continue with the small steps towards community repair. That is so important, I believe. We don't we think in terms of things needing, big splashy answers to our problems. And frequently, I don't believe that's true. On the neighborhood level, family level, neighborhood, whatever, community level, school level, church level, it's small stuff. It's really small stuff that we just have gotten away from. Knowing each other, hanging out with each other, being outside with other Americans, for God's sakes. What a concept.
Yeah.
So
that's great. I really want to thank Jim Creedon for his question for today's episode. He does those small steps, but in a big way, helping our youth in education, in schools, in prevention, which I think is key, very key in stopping the overdoses and addiction. And I really want to thank you, Sam, for Dreamland and for The Least of Us. Your books help us understand addiction, explain where they come from, help eliminate stigma, tell us what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong, and really give us an outline on recovery covering as a nation. So I really thank you for that.
Oh, you're so welcome, Dr. Lev. I really appreciate the interest, and thank you very much for taking the time to chat. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to High Truths on Drugs and Addiction, where national experts give you facts and answer your questions. This week's episode would not be possible without the generous support from our sponsors. A sincere and warm thank you to CCR, Center for Community Research in San Diego, enhancing public health and safety through informed action. If you would like to sponsor a show, we would be honored and grateful. Please contact us on hightruths.com. We thank you for listening and hope you will help our rating by giving us 5 stars and subscribe so you won't miss any of our informed, packed weekly shows. Visit our website, hightruths.com, to submit a question, take a quiz, or download a free prescription for naloxone. Until next week, this is High Truths on Drugs and Addiction. Our producer is Dave Rivas from Davey Boy Productions. I am your host, Dr. Ronit Lev, and we hope we brought your day a little bit more high truths.